Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Dino, and today I've got a little bit of free time on my hands, so I thought maybe I would set the valves on my DR650. Now this really doesn't take that long to do, but I did find this particular video seemed to stretch out a little bit longer than I anticipated. So as always, the timecode chapters in the description will allow you to skip through if all you want to do is set your valves. Now, if you want to stick around and listen to me babble about all the components on the DR650's head, the valves, the springs, that kind of thing, then by all means do. Sit back, grab yourself something cold to drink, and enjoy the show today on Dino's Tinker Shed. So the DR650 is really a simple engine, but it still has a 4-valve head, which allows it to breathe really well. And what that means is it has 2 intake and 2 exhaust valves that periodically need to be adjusted to make sure the bike is running in its optimal condition, its best performance. Now, depending on whether you've bought the bike brand new or whether you've had it for a lot of years, the adjustment interval is a little bit different. So I would suggest that if you've just bought a used bike, you should probably adjust your valves and check them right away because you don't really know the history. And if you've bought a brand new bike, well, the manual will tell you that you really should have those valves adjusted at a 1,000 kilometer interval to start with. Now, once you've done that initial adjustment, the manual actually says you can go 12,000 kilometers between valve adjustments. Now, that's probably absolutely satisfactory, but I think most DR owners are probably a little bit more like me, and I usually have to tank off anything that I own at the end of the season as I'm cleaning it, and the valve adjustment is a really simple process to check, and it can give you some diagnosis in terms of how that cylinder head is both performing and whether or not you're getting excessive wear. So today we're going to take a look at the different components of the valve. I'll try to explain the best that I can how your valve train works. You're going to see some of my arts and crafts ability in terms of some drawing, which I'm not going to be too proud of. But hopefully I can explain exactly how your valve train works and why you may be getting different types of results when you go in and measure your valves. And you should be doing that before you actually adjust them. You should go in there and actually determine how the valves are wearing, if they're wearing at all. Sometimes you'll check these and they'll be perfectly within spec, and you basically close up the inspection ports and you're off and running. But if you are finding wear on them, you can have a bit of an overview, a bit of an idea of where the wear is happening. Okay, let's get started. Well, here is my very rudimentary drawing of how a valve train fits within your DR650. So there's a few more parts that I want to talk about that aren't here, but it would have been a little bit too complicated for this basic guy to draw. So when we talk about your valves, that piece of technology or that piece of equipment is actually this piece here, this sort of trumpet shaped piece that fits vertically within the valve train. And that valve moves up and down within the cylinder head, which I've got here in green. And as it opens or moves into your combustion cylinder, it allows either intake gases or exhaust gases to flow down alongside of it and then into the combustion chamber, where it is ultimately either compressed and exploded if it's gas and air mixture, or it's pushed out by the piston around the valve and out your exhaust, maybe over here. So your exhaust and your intake valves work exactly the same way, but just in reverse order. So when the intake valve is open, the exhaust valve's closed, and when the exhaust valve is open, the intake valve is closed. Now, you'll see that as you come down to the edge of this bell shape, you actually have a angled grind around the base of the valve here. And this is a precision machined grind that fits against this piece here, which is your valve seat. So your valve seat is typically a hardened metal ring. It looks like a donut that's pressed into the softer aluminum head so that your valves don't just completely wear the head out during operation. The valve itself is also hardened. So basically these things open and then forms a perfect seal between the valve seat and the valve itself. When the bike's brand new or when you get a valve job done, these things will hold water. That's how watertight, how precision the seal is on these pieces of equipment. Now, when you install a valve into the head, you actually use a valve spring at the top here. So the valve comes up and there is a ring at the top that, in the case of the DR650, is held in place with a couple cone-shaped wedges around this basically it's a washer. And they wedge against the valve stem and hold this spring under tension so that it actually pulls the valve upwards against the seat. So there really isn't any mechanical device that pulls the valve up. It's really just spring pressure. And this is why higher performance engines tend to have higher pressure springs, because as the engine RPMs increase, you can get what's called valve float, where the spring is not responsive or not strong enough to pull the valve back up into the cylinder head fast enough to keep up with the RPMs of the engine. And that's why Ducati went with their Desmo engines. They physically pulled the valve back up so you could rev those engines just unbelievably high. But the downside was the valve adjustments were a little bit more intensive and a little more frequent than a traditional valve train that uses springs. And realistically, the DR650 is not a high revving engine, so springs work quite well. Now, what I don't have drawn here is there is usually a valve guide at the top, which it basically takes that wear and tear similar to the valve seats down here and keeps the valve aligned in this this hole that's drilled through the head. And on top of that, there will be a valve seal, which is basically like a small rubber cap. I don't know what it's made out of exactly, but it stops oil that's lubricating the valve train from draining down through the valves and into the cylinder here. And when you do actually take the valve head or the cylinder head off to lap the valves or to put new valves in, you're always going to change for sure the valve seals, and oftentimes the stem guides as well, the valve guides. So those aren't really drawn, but they sit right around in here. Then you have your rocker arm, which sits inside of the cylinder head itself. So this would all be covered here and basically bathed in oil. But you have a rocker arm that basically sits on a pivot. So it's like a seesaw basically above your valve. And this rocker arm is moved by your camshafts, which sit above and are driven by a chain that runs from the cam all the way down to your crankshaft. As this cam turns, you can see it's bigger on one end and smaller on the other. So as this rotates, it's going to push up on the teeter-totter, for lack of a better term, or your rocker arm, and will push down over here on this adjustment bolt. Okay. It will in turn push straight down on the valve, opening the valve down here. And that is how your valve train actually works. Now, to ensure that the valves fully close and fully open, Manufacturers often use a gapping system right here between this adjustment screw and the very top of the valve. So when you hear people say they're going to adjust their valves, what they're actually doing is verifying the distance between the top of the valve, the stem itself, and this adjustment bolt or whatever they use. So sometimes they don't use screws and bolts like the DR, they use shim under buckets and things like that. But basically, there will be a mechanism to ensure that this gap meets the manufacturer's specifications. Now, if this, as I said, the valve train itself is a wear item, and there are two places that the valve train typically wears. The most common is between the valve grind and the valve seat. So as this moves up and down, you can imagine there's an exceptional amount of pressure, which ultimately leads to some wear on this particular surface or the valve seats here themselves. Because these are tapered, as this wears, the valve actually moves up ever so slightly over time. So the valve basically becomes smaller in diameter and therefore gets pushed up into the taper, meaning that the gap between the valve stem and the adjustment bolt becomes less. Now that is the most typical type of wear that you're going to see in a valve system, and it's normal. These are consumables. Over time you do need to service these things and ultimately replace them. Now, if there is the potential for the top of this valve stem to start to wear faster than the base. Okay, so these are like a case hardened type of steel. They're very hard. As is this bolt. This isn't just a grade 5 bolt. This is a hardened bolt here. But occasionally there will be a valve or a bolt that didn't maybe get hardened correctly, or perhaps just has so many miles on it that it starts to mushroom the end of the valve stem out, or the adjustment bolt itself starts to wear, and this gap will actually start to get a little bit wider at the top. So typically, most often, when you adjust your valves, the gap will be tighter than it was the last time that you adjusted them. But occasionally you will see that it will get wider, and that's usually due to either mushrooming up top here or an adjustment bolt that maybe wasn't hardened enough and it's actually starting to mushroom. So that's a little bit of diagnosis that you can do. And this is why it's important to keep records when you actually work on this, because otherwise you're going to have some problems. So the good news is adjusting your valves really is not all that hard. It's something the average home mechanic can take on themselves and do a really good job at. Most of the work is done with basic hand tools, and the specialty tools that you need, such as feeler gauges, are readily available and reasonably priced. So really it just takes some time, some patience, and you can do this. Now when you do decide to adjust your valves, remember you want to adjust the valves while the engine's cold. And you're going to need to find top dead center. And I'm going to show you how to do that in this video. It's not that hard, but top dead center of the engine is very important to make sure that the valves and the cam are in the right positions to actually check the valve clearance. If you fail to do that, well, you might be setting your valves incorrectly. Okay, now let's get to work on this really fun project. So in order to actually perform this work, we need a few tools. And they're simple tools, they're not really that hard. You're gonna need a 10mm wrench for sure. This one's nice because it has the 8mm on it as well, you know, when you're working on other things, but you definitely need a 10mm wrench. And you need a few specialty tools. Now you can get by with a small adjustable for holding the top of the valve bolt, but it's not perfect. And this one's a nice one. It's made by Crescent here. But let me show you the bolts that we need to adjust. So I actually have a couple brand new parts from Suzuki that I can show you here. So this is the actual adjuster bolt that clamps down on top or tightens down on top of the valve stem. And this is the nut that actually, it's a jam nut basically. And these two fit together like that. So how these work is you adjust the gap between this hardened surface and the top of the valve stem like we talked about, and then this jam nut gets tightened down against the top of the rocker arm, stopping this bolt from drifting in and out. Now in order to do that, if anyone's ever used jam nuts before, you have to hold the bolt firm in place before you start to tighten this down, or basically that bolt's going to move. Now if you take a look here on the top, and it's hard to see, this is actually a square stud on the top there, and that is about 2.7 millimeters across the top. So like I said, you can use a small adjustable like this to try and hold it, and then the 10 millimeter on there to jam it down, but it's a little bit awkward, and you're going to see that once we get underneath the bike. And they do sell a specialized tool for this, and I made one out of an old 10 millimeter socket that fits down over top, and then you can reach in, I don't know if you can see that or not, you can reach in and hold it from the top with this. So this fits in, it locks down, and then you can tighten the jam nut up. But what is this? It's obviously an Allen key, but what have I got welded on the end here? Well, believe it or not, this is actually a Robertson screw. Yay Canada, right? Yeah, Canadian invention, the Robertson screw. The square drive, and it's a number 2 screw that fits on the top there. So if you look, here's a number 2 red Robertson. It is the exact same size as that stud. So you can do something as simple as this, which I've turned a little thing on my wood lathe and drove a screw in there, and then that literally fits in perfectly in there, and you can hold it and tighten it down like that. I've made a couple of these. I got another one here, but you can see it's just a good quality wood screw that gives you enough purchase that you can then get your 10 millimeter wrench on there to lock that jam nut down. So you need some type of mechanism to do that. So whether it's making this little device here, they sell these, you can buy these on Amazon I think, or certainly ProCycle or Fort 9 sell these in Canada, and they're not terribly expensive. It's just I always have all of these extra sockets and Allen keys from different things that get delivered to me. I just make my own. But anyway, that's a tool. You're going to need something, like I say, this or this, you know, you're going to need something to hold that. Now, maybe the most important part, certainly after you get by that, is how do you measure the gap? Well, you do that with these. These are feeler gauges. And these are a very simple set here. They are, these ones I think are brass, and they're varying thicknesses, and those thicknesses are marked somehow. I'm trying to get this so you can read it on the ends. Let me get this one. Maybe this one's a little easier to read. So this one's an older set. This is a Blue Point. These are made out of steel, and you can see they're a little bit rusty. And then ultimately, these are my most recent set. These are made in China, and these are inexpensive. You can buy these on Amazon or just about any parts store out there. But you can kind of see here, this one here, which I bent the end on, is 7 thousandths of an inch thick, or about 0.18 millimeters of an inch thick. So what we do is we fit these in between that bolt and the top of the valve stem. That's how we determine the gap that we want. So there's a minimum and a maximum gap. Now, I've used these for years. These are a well-used set. You can see I've modified them a bit. But the last time I ordered from ProCycle, I ordered a set of these. Now these are custom-made clearance tools that are made specifically for the DR650. Now the one complaint I have about these, they look very well made, but it's very hard to read the letters and the numbers here to see what's what. So I used an old Dungeons and Dragons trick. So if you ever play Dungeons and Dragons, you know reading the numbers on the dice can be hard. So what we do is we take a white crayon, we press the white crayon into the holes, and then we wipe the excess off. And now you can see the numbers. So this is 4 thou, this is 5 thou. And the back stampings weren't as good, but I'm going to go ahead and probably put this one into red so I know one is exhaust and one is intake. But I like them so far. We're going to use this set today, but by all means, this set here will do the same job and is more flexible for other job tasks around your shop. So, you know, if you're working on other types of small equipment, a good set of feeler gauges like this is much more useful than these. But these, I think, are a little bit of a luxury item, and they weren't all that much money. So I bought a set. Okay, I think that's pretty much all the tools we need. Let's get looking at the bike. Now, one of the things that you have to do in order to adjust the valves on a DR650 is take off your fuel tank. Now, I have a Safari tank on here, and I think most DR owners still have the factory stock tank. Now, since my friend Carl's bike also has an aftermarket tank on it, I'm going to use some old footage to show you how to take a stock tank off so you can see the process. Now, please excuse me, because it's old footage, some of it's a little bit blurrier than I would really like it to be, but, you know, please forgive me, I'm trying.
Now the tank really is easy to get off, but it starts by taking off the seat, and that starts by taking off these side panels that are held on with one Phillips head bolt, and then they slide down like this, and that reveals these 12mm headed bolts that hold the seat on. So now that we got one panel off, let's take off the left hand side. We'll slide that off, and then we'll get to work on these 12mm headed bolts here. So there's one on each side, and they're pretty easy to take out. Now once you get these out, you basically just push down on the front of the seat and slide it back, and the whole seat comes off. It's really quite easy. Next, we're going to focus on the fuel tank. So we're going to put the petcock into the PRI or prime position, and then we're going to take off the fuel hose. And I like to take it off at the carburetor, so I just loosen one of the clamps and slide it off. And I catch any excess gas in a cup here just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. There's not a lot. Next, we have to take off the vacuum hose that keeps the petcock closed on a stock DR. So this is that hose right here, and I'm just going to slide this clamp back with these needle nose pliers, and then this hose comes off as well. It's pretty easy. Now we're going to take off these two bolts. They've got 10mm heads on them. Once that's done, the tank itself basically just lifts off. There's really not a lot else holding it on other than a couple rubber pucks underneath the tank that are attached to the frame rails, and you'll see that in a minute. So now it's just a matter of lifting up the back of the tank and rocking it back like this, and you'll see those pucks up near where the S is on the front of the tank. There they are. You don't want to lose these. And that's it. You're done. Now, to adjust your valves, you've got to take off these inspection covers on the top of the engine. But before we do that, we need to clean this engine up. You can see there's some gunge and gross stuff. And we really need to start by pulling out a spark plug as well. So we need to clean around the spark plugs so no garbage falls down in there. These recessed holes tend to have a habit of collecting dirt. So I'm going to start first by using some air pressure and just blowing off the entire top of the engine, including around the valve covers. and the spark plug holes themselves. And I'll follow this up with a cleaner. In this case, I'm going to use brake cleaner, and I'm going to use a toothbrush here just to scrub all of this oil away. Now, I'm not sure where this little bit of oil came from. I'm not sure if I have a little bit of a leak around one of these head bolts here. I'm not 100% sure, but I want to clean the area well before I do anything else. And I'm going to use some air pressure and a rag just to blow out the brake cleaner from inside the spark plug wells. And the air pressure will also help dry off that brake cleaner to make sure the area is nice and clean before we get moving. That looks pretty good. I think it's nice and clean. So I'm going to pull out the front spark plug here. We do this to reduce compression as we turn the engine over to find top dead center. So I'm just going to spin this one out. We can have a look at it here. It's overall in pretty good shape. And I'm going to show you how to adjust the spark plug gap later too. Now, to find top dead center, we have to take the flywheel bolt access cover and the timing plug out to assist us. So we're going to clean this area really well with brake cleaner before we do anything. Now, both of these plugs are really notorious for the internal Allen key stripping out. So make sure to use a high quality sharp tool. In this case, an 8mm for the timing plug cover and a 10mm to take out the flywheel bolt access cover plug. And you'll see on both of these when you get them out, I do use a fair amount of anti-seize on these when I reinstall them. Just take your time because they can get damaged really easy.
So how does somebody know which set of valves is the intake and which one is the exhaust? Well, it's pretty easy to do. If you look here where the exhaust is, directly above it will be your exhaust valve adjustment, and over here where the carburetor is, well, that means this is your intake. It really is pretty simple.
These covers really do come off quite easily. Take your time. If you want, you can use a socket. I'm using an open-ended wrench here, but basically you just break the bolt free and then you can spin them out with your fingers. So again, this is the intake cover, and you'll see as the cover comes off, it exposes the intake valves. And the exhaust cover is exactly the same way. So again, take your time. These aren't in here overly tight. They use O-rings, and you can pop these out. Now, an interesting thing is both of the covers and the bolts are interchangeable. It's the exact same part number for the intake and exhaust cover. So you don't have to worry about mixing these things up. Now that the cover's off, we can see the rocker here, the adjustment bolt, and the jam nut. Now I've got to turn the crankshaft. I'm going to use this 17mm 6-point deep well on a T-handle to turn the crank counterclockwise, and you only want to turn it counterclockwise. Now as I do this, I'm going to watch the intake valves. They're going to open, and as soon as they close, right here, I'm going to look at the inspection port until the alignment mark centers itself in the hole. And there's a little T on top, so you know you're at top dead center. Now we can go ahead and check with our feeler gauges between the bolt and the top of the valve stem to see. Now this valve on the intake side is good. This one here is a little bit tight, so I'm going to adjust this one. So to do that, I'm going to take my 10mm open-ended wrench. Now you can use a socket on this as well. I just did this for you to see more than anything. And I'm going to loosen the jam nut off a little bit here. And I'm going to put that little homemade tool of mine on top of the adjustment bolt. And it just sort of snaps on. Now I'm going to turn that down onto the appropriate sized feeler gauge, and when I get to where I think it's proper, I'm going to snug it down here, and I'm going to come back in and see if it has moved. Now in this case it was good, so I'm going to use my tool here and really tighten down the jam nut. Now take a look at the Allen key holding the top. It does not move when I tighten the jam nut, and that's what you want. And of course, you're going to follow this up one last time to make sure you have the valve set right. Sometimes when you tighten that jam nut, you end up tightening up the valve clearance. But in this case, I think I did okay.
So as I said before, you can use a standard feeler gauge. You don't have to buy the aftermarket custom DR650 feeler gauges. And the nice thing about a regular set of feeler gauges is you can take them apart and just use the one you want. This one's an 8 thou, so this is what works on the exhaust. And I can go back in like this and double check, and sure enough, it's just perfect. It just barely fits in, so I know I've got 8/1000ths of an inch. Now, when you're adjusting these valves, try to adjust them to the high side of the threshold. So for the exhaust, it is 6 to 8,000 clearance. I want to set it to 8/1000ths because remember, as we talked about in the beginning, the valve gap tends to shrink over time, not normally expand. So if you adjust it to the maximum gap, you're going to be able to leave your valves unadjusted for a longer period of time.
All right, now it's really just a matter of reinstalling the valve covers, and you'll see I've added some anti-seize, some copper anti-seize to these bolts. I just like to run them down with my fingers first to make sure that they are seated well. And you want to inspect the O-rings too to make sure they're not damaged even before you put the covers on. And then I just snug these up. I don't even think there's a torque rating because there's a gasket under there, an O-ring gasket. These don't have to be super, super tight, just snug.
Okay, let's talk about spark plugs. So here are the two plugs that I took out of the bike. Now these are an NGK plug. They're a CR10E, which is what the actual manual calls for. Now some people will debate and say that you should run the CR9E, which is one heat range hotter. I like to run what the bike says to run, so I'm running the CR10Es. And you can see there's a little bit of goo around the top here, and I believe that is really from the dielectric grease that I put on it. Overall, the burn pattern is pretty good. Now, I'm not an expert on reading plugs, but it's a nice tan brown color. There's no real oil deposits or anything on here. So I think these are running okay. I'm going to clean them up and I'm going to gap them. Now, similar to your valves, your spark plugs have a gap here as well between the electrode and the center electrode. Now on a DR650, I believe the range is 28 thou to 31 thou, I think. I'll double check that for sure. But you can adjust that using a few different methods. You can use one of these, and you can see I've darkened in with black crayon the same way I did the feeler gauges. And I normally set them at 30 thou. That's sort of an in-between mark. Or you can use something like this. Oh my gosh, look, a feeler gauge. So remember when I said how these style of feeler gauges are more useful? Well, you can actually use this feeler gauge to adjust your spark plugs as well. And I'm not sure if this one has it. Some of them actually have a little tool on the side here for bending the electrode. This one obviously doesn't have that, but it's something that you can certainly look for if you do look for one of these. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean all the gunge up here on the wire wheel. I'll clean all the electrodes up. Then we'll gap them. I'll put a little bit more anti-seize on there, and then we'll thread them back in and tighten them down. Okay, I've got these cleaned up, and you can see they cleaned up quite well. Now, a lot of people will say, spark plugs are cheap. Why not just buy new ones? And I agree. They're inexpensive. These are about $4 or $5 each, I guess. But the reality is they work fine. There's no detonation. Nothing's melted. So I can put that $5 into something else. Call me cheap. So anyway, I'm just going to check to make sure that the gap is still good on these. So what I'm going to do is this is sort of a tapered ramp style gauge. It's not necessarily the most accurate, but I'm going to slide it in here. And the reason I'm using the imperial scale is if I try to actually put it in this way, it doesn't work. It's sort of, the ramp gets in the way. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to set them to 30 grand, or 30,000th of an inch, I should say. So I put it in there and I slide it, and you'll see that
this side here of the electrode is right at 30,000, and that's where I want it to be. Remember, these are ramped, so I want to make sure that that 30,000 is just on the one side, not on both. And geez, I just about got it stuck in there. That's still good. And I can double check that with this 30 thou here. It just barely fits in. It looks really good. So I think these are ready to reinstall. I'm just again going to put a little bit of anti-seize on here, and I actually found the actual spark plug protector that I've been using. I had it hidden in a drawer, so I'll use this stuff here on the boots as well, just to avoid the boots from sticking, and it keeps moisture out. Very good. Let's get that done. Okay, so what if your spark plug isn't gapped right? It's either too big or too small. So this spark plug's gapped at about 23 thousandths, I guess, roughly. So this is just a junk plug that I have. So let's really open that gap up a bit. So this tool, there's varying different tools. Some of them they've got a little slot cut in them, and you stick them and you bend the electrode up with the tool. This one's more like a screwdriver that you stick in and you lever up on the electrode itself. The problem is this one's pretty high, so I can't really get purchase. So what I do in a situation like this is I'll just put a screwdriver down on the body of the spark plug, and then I can reach in and I can give it a little bit of a bend. And you can see I really opened it up there. So now we went from 23 thou up to, oh boy, 38. So now I want to take it down to 35 thousandths. So you can use this tool. You can get on here like this, and you can kind of bend it down a little bit. I find that to be a little bit difficult. So often I'll just use a ball peen hammer like this. I'll put it in the vise, and I'll just very, very gently come in and tap it until I get it down to where I want it, like that. So that's how I gap a spark plug. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Again, this one's just a piece of junk here. I don't care if I destroy it or not, but it gives you an idea of how to actually get that gap consistent for each one of your plugs. Okay, hopefully that helps. So anytime you're putting in spark plugs, thread them in with your fingers first, and then you can chase them down to the surface using the extension. Now, I run them up until they touch the surface, and then I tighten it about a quarter turn to compress the crush washer on the spark plug. Then I'm going to use some dielectric grease here on the porcelain. So this will be sort of smeared down the porcelain as you put on the boots, and it'll seal it from water and the elements. So we're just about done. And that really is all it takes to adjust the valves on a DR650. Now, your motorcycle may be different if it isn't a DR. There are a few different styles of valve adjustment out there on the market, and some motorcycles, well, they don't need valve adjustments at all. It really does pay to get a manual and read it to determine what your service intervals are. Now, failure to adjust your valves when required can lead to a number of problems. It can lead to hard starting or maybe no starting at all if your decompression system is tied to your valve lash. Now, if they're really out of whack, you'll get really poor performance, and you may even damage your engine. So it really does pay to look at this every once in a while as per the manual. So this was really fun. I had a great time having everybody here in the shop. So until next time, I'm Dino for Dino's Tinker Shed. You have yourself a really nice day, and I'll see you soon.